Ontario Diagnostic Days 2022 on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus, Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, Grain Farmers of Ontario, Agris Co-op, BASF Canada, Bear and DeKalb, Corteva and Pioneer, Great Lakes Grain, Mazex, The Mosaic Company, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin. Welcome to Day 4 of Ontario Diagnostic Days. On this episode, we're going to show you two more presentations that we filmed back in July during the in-field event at Ridgetown Campus, University of Guelph. We'll kick things off with OMAFRA plant pathologist Albert Tenuta as he offers tips on how to manage corn foliar leaf diseases. He'll shine the spotlight on northern corn leaf blight and share how growers can combine genetics and fungicides to fight this disease. We'll then talk herbicide injury and crop sensitivity with OMAFRA weed specialist Mike Cowbrough. He'll show us how certain species of plants are more sensitive to herbicides. He'll also demonstrate how environmental conditions can affect some herbicides, especially in a dry year. Again, CEU credits are available for Diagnostic Days. For this episode, we've embedded the QR code right in the video. You'll see it as you watch. Here's episode 4.
So today at the Ontario Diagnostic Days, we have all kinds of different sessions. The most interesting one is going to be the foliar disease one. And here we are looking at foliar disease, how to manage them, how to identify them, and what's going on this year. So if we look over here, our example is looking at northern corn leaf blight. You can see here, if we look on these leaves, very typical northern corn leaf blight symptoms. When it comes to foliar leaf diseases, three things to look at: size, shape, and color. We can see here our typical northern corn leaf blight, that cigar-shaped lesion, that elongated lesion, very happy fungus in this particular case. You can see that it's also an older lesion. It's starting to sporulate, so it's happy, happy, happy. The other thing to look at with these lesions too is how is it progressing? Here's a younger lesion. You can see this nice water-soaked border around it. It is the margin of progression where the disease is going. It gives you confirmation that that fungus is alive, it's working. We use our management tools such as genetic resistance, foliar fungicide to stop the fungus and stop it in its tracks. So one of the goals of the Ontario Diagnostic Days is to bring growers, agronomists, crop consultants in there and look at different approaches to managing issues. One of them is diseases, foliar diseases, and one of the best baseline management tools is genetics. And so we're going to go over there and look at how to utilize genetics to manage northern corn leaf blight. So here we've got our plots. We've got 7 different inbreds here with various different genes for resistance against northern corn leaf blight. HT genes. Hey, if we look at this one on my left here, this one has no resistance genes whatsoever. We see typical northern corn leaf blight lesions here. Those cigar-shaped, elongated, happy fungus here. It's sporulating. It's doing what northern corn leaf blight loves to do, which is infect and cause problems. On my right here, we've got the traditional HT1 gene. It's been around for a while, but we can also see that we've got quite a bit of northern corn leaf blight lesions on here. It's still effective. It has, if we go down the row, it still has less than the inbred with nothing, but it's not as effective as it used to be. Why? We're seeing more and more races. Our recent surveys are seeing anywhere from 16 races a few years ago up to 23 different races. So HT1 gene is effective, but not as effective as it used to be. So if we go down to this next series of hybrids here, you'll see this one here. Again, it's got some northern corn leaf blight. It's very typical here, but it looks different. Remember, size, shape, color. Here we're starting to see some northern corn leaf blight, and then this, what we call this chlorotic response from the HT source of resistance, and you're seeing it's trying to compartmentalize or inhibit growth of the northern corn leaf blight pathogen, and you're seeing different symptoms here. So it's working better than the HT1 gene, but we still have some lesions here that are typical. That means those races that are here are able to bypass that resistance. Here on this one that has HT3 gene, we're also seeing similar. We're seeing less than we saw earlier on with the HT1 and without. But again, we still have some, not to the same degree, so it's working much more effectively. Why are we seeing disease even on these genes? Because we're looking at what we call a race-specific resistance. Either has the gene and it corresponds to that race of the pathogen. If they have the two, it's absolute, you won't get infection. But what happens when you have multiple different races, it's able to jump over that resistance and hence get disease. So if you've got resistance to HT2 or race 2, you're able, anything like 1, M, N, and those other races, you'll get infection. So let's go over here and see how we can build on those resistance genes and maybe bump up that resistance, that baseline resistance. And in this particular case, we've got another inbred here, same thing, no resistance genes whatsoever. And you'll see that overall compared to the other inbred, we see some northern corn leaf blight, but nowhere near to the same degree as where we were over there without any resistance. This is what we call partial resistance, or some people call it field tolerance. If you start with this, your level is higher, you're reducing your disease, you're starting at a better spot. So utilizing partial resistance is also an effective tool, and if you combine that with some other genes, in this particular case the HTN and HTM gene, now you're seeing pretty good effective control for northern corn leaf blight using the plants themselves to protect yourself against northern corn leaf blight. That's part of the story. The other part of that story is fungicides. We can use an integrated management program for northern corn leaf blight, and that's using genetics and fungicides. Let's talk about fungicides next. So we've looked at how to scout and identify northern corn leaf blight. We looked at genetics and how to utilize genetics and the genes, whether race-specific resistance, partial resistance, in limiting northern corn leaf blight. Now, fungicides. Hey, when it comes to fungicides, we've got a lot more options now than we used to have 3, 5, 10 years ago. A lot of them are very effective. I work closely with my US colleagues on the corn disease working group, and we go about identifying and looking at different fungicides and the different diseases that affect them. In Ontario, we often will do northern corn leaf blight, gray leaf spot, and gibberella, as well as this past year, tar spot, and we provide those efficacies into the collection with the corn disease working group here. And so you can see from this table, we have a lot of good options for northern corn leaf blight control, very good fungicide options. These fungicides also have the benefit of helping and controlling other common diseases that we have in Ontario. It's also important, selection of the fungicide, but the timing, and that is critically important. So for us, our VT-R1 application timing has always been the most effective, provided the greatest return on investment for producers, and whether it's northern corn leaf blight, gibberella, and as we saw last year with tar spot. So utilizing fungicides in an integrated northern corn leaf blight management program, which incorporates resistance and scouting, is an effective way to limit your losses and maximize your yields.
Welcome to our crop sensitivity to herbicide demo at Diagnostic Days. We have 4 different field crops. We have 17 different herbicides applied post-emergent and pre-emergent. It gives us a nice opportunity to compare how different crops respond under different environmental conditions to a whole bunch of different common herbicides in the province. And why we do this demo is, sometimes it's nice during a busy season. You're thinking, maybe I can cut the corner on cleaning up this sprayer before going into a crop. This really gives a bird's eye view of certain species of plants that are more sensitive to herbicides than others. So it gives you kind of that intelligence, as well as it shows you how environmental conditions really affect the performance of some of these herbicides, especially in a dry year, and the implications of that for herbicide carryover. And then lastly, it gives us a nice opportunity to look at some differences in weed control, right? Some products, even though they're from the same chemical family, you might think they'd be good on the same weed, but we see some subtle differences here that make all the difference when you're trying to control some nasty weeds like a Canada thistle, like a Canada fleabane. So enough chit-chat. Let's get into this and see some of the cool differences amongst the crops and the herbicides and the weeds. So again, we're going to look at a number of different herbicides, and some herbicides work by the sensitive plants germinating, taking up that herbicide in the soil profile, and then that's how they die. So we need a lot of rainfall to activate that herbicide, meaning to drive it into the soil layer so that the target seeds are surrounded by herbicides, so that when they do germinate, they take up that herbicide. And so, as you might imagine, a really dry year, or certainly dry after application, that herbicide doesn't get into the soil profile, the seeds don't take it up as they germinate, and they survive. And we actually are seeing a lot of that at this demo because we had no moisture after the soil applied herbicides went down. And so, yeah, by and large, we have plants surviving that maybe shouldn't if we had moisture to activate. But planting depth also plays a role. So if we're a little bit shallow with our planting depth, that physically creates a situation where the seed is closer to that herbicide layer, and we have maybe a better chance of getting some contact with the herbicide to cause the desired effect, which in some cases is to kill the plant. So I want to showcase to you a sensitive crop here, oats. And just even in this area here, as we go down, you'll notice that there's variable planting depth, right? So I'm going to pull up an oat plant here. And it doesn't take me long to find the seed of that oat plant. It's right there. And, if I put the ruler or the tape measure up against there, I'm being pretty generous by saying that was planted about 1/2 inch deep. So that's pretty shallow. So a couple of things. It might not germinate very quickly, but it is closer to the herbicide layer, so that if there is any moisture, it's going to be taken up much sooner than maybe in a plant like this that's much more bigger, because it was actually planted, in this case, a little over 1 inch deep, right? So this is over 1 inch deep. There's a couple of benefits from a crop perspective. It's planted into moisture, it's going to germinate sooner, and it's going to pop out of the ground. It's also further away from the herbicide layer, so it also has a chance to survive. So let's just look at this example. If we actually want to keep oats, we don't want, like, this is a cultivated crop of oats, we wanted to keep oats, we're going to see much more likely to see herbicide injury when we plant shallow, because it's physically closer to the soil herbicide layer, and it could be taken, germinating shoots more likely to take up herbicide and have injury. And we have examples in this plot area of that. Whereas when we plant it deeper, not only are we planting it into moisture, but we're physically planting it further away from the herbicide layer. We need a lot of moisture to drive that herbicide down. It gives the crop an opportunity to get out of the ground. And once it gets bigger, it gets out of the ground, it's a lot more tolerant, or can metabolize the herbicide a lot more. So the combination of planting depth, right, planting deeper into the soil profile, and a lack of moisture, if you're wanting to maximize crop safety, that's at the benefit of species like oats. So let's see how planting depth affects oats with a very potent herbicide on this otherwise sensitive crop. So this is a herbicide called pyroxasulfone, and that's the active ingredient. We've actually been looking at this as an option to maybe suppress wild oat growth in barley or spring wheat. And this is a cultivated oat crop, and you can see here we had about 4 or 5 rows that were shallowly planted, like a ½ inch deep. And it gets enough moisture to where you're starting to see, these aren't lethal effects, but quite a bit of stunting. The seed and the root and the shoot of the plant is taking up that herbicide, and we're getting the desired response. You can see over here, if we look to my left though, this is where, again, the crop was planted about 1 inch deep, 1.5 inches deep almost. No moisture to activate the herbicide, so the seed germinated, the roots and shoots established, got out of the ground before the activating herbicide could do anything. And so by comparison, much more healthier oat plant in this case. And that's from a wild oat control perspective. That's why we see a lot of variability with this active ingredient. If we get moisture for activation and those seeds are shallow in the soil, we get pretty decent control. If they're deep in the soil profile, we don't get a lot of rain. They survive quite nicely. So now we're going to look at a group of herbicides known as Group 2 herbicides. So they're either sulfonylurea or imidazole known herbicides. That's the family they're from. And what we want to show here is that just because they're from the same family doesn't mean that crops respond the same way to different herbicides. So what we're seeing here in this crop of white beans is kind of typical Group 2 herbicide injury, where we see some obvious signs of stunting, some chlorosis on the trifoliate leaves there, along with some leaf distortion. And then we sometimes see the browning or even purpling on the veins of the underside of the leaf, right? And so as we're looking at an affected crop like this, like quite clearly, visually, you can see the injury is quite severe. What you want to look at now to determine if this plant is going to survive or whether it's maybe going to get worse before instead of better is by looking at the new growth of the plant, right? So if I pull out this plant, the newer trifoliate leaves actually are the more severely affected. And that's generally not a good sign. If we look at the new growth and it looks healthy and green and unaffected, that gives us pause for optimism, especially if the lower leaves are injured. But on this kind of crop, because the injury is so severe, it might not be lethal in this case, but certainly we'd be looking at yield loss. So quite clearly this herbicide, which is known under the trade name Classic, very good soybean herbicide. Lots of crop safety there, but on white beans are extremely sensitive to this particular active ingredient in that Group 2 herbicide family. So let's see how white beans respond to a different post-emergent Group 2 herbicide. So here we have another post-emergent Group 2 herbicide called Permit. So the active ingredient is halosulfuron. It can be applied both pre-emergent and post-emergent to dry beans, or in this case white beans. Here with Classic, you'll notice the new growth doesn't look good at all. And then if we compare that though to Permit or halosulfuron, like if you compare the new growth on both those plants, I mean, this is quite good, whereas this is severely affected. And so we would expect that even though this has a little bit of chlorosis, almost no meaningful cause for concern on the injury in terms of yield loss, whereas this, we're looking at significant levels of yield loss if this herbicide is accidentally applied on white beans. And so here we're looking at Permit applied to white beans, but pre-emergent as opposed to post. We know it's registered post, and there's a little bit of crop injury there, but pre has always traditionally been a much safer application window for this herbicide. And so it's the preferred application timing for Permit in white beans. So we talked about soil-applied herbicides and the need to get moisture to activate them so that the germinating seed takes up the herbicide. But there's some herbicides that are purely contact herbicide, meaning that they are taken up through the foliage of the plant. And so you need kind of a young, actively growing plant that can take up that herbicide easily and get to the appropriate growing points, right? And it has no residual activity, so if you don't have stuff up, it's not going to kill anything that's under the ground and germinating and has yet to germinate. And so this is an example, again, of another Group 2 herbicide in cereals called Simplicity. We see over here on the white bean side that it has all those typical Group 2 herbicide injury symptoms: the yellowing, the stunting, the browning of the veins. But what I want to show you here, though, is if we compare white beans when this herbicide was applied prior to them being planted, they're completely safe, because again, the herbicide has little to no residual activity, and so those plants that have not yet come out of the ground aren't going to be effective. Case in point, let's look at the oats. We have oats here that were emerged. This herbicide is very effective at taking wild oats out of spring wheat or spring barley. These were applied, that herbicide was applied about 10 days ago, and it's about half the height of oats compared to our post-emergent application over there, which is about almost 15 inches tall compared to this 6 or 7 inches over here. So that indicates a purely contact herbicide with no residual activity. And that's also then why people always talk about the importance of weed size at the time of application, because we have some honkin' velvet leaf in here. So let's take a look at those velvet leaf. I'm just going to walk over here. These are massive velvet leaf. Good Lord, they're 6 to 8 inches tall. They have 2, 4, 6, over 10 leaves. So most herbicide labels want velvet leaf at about 4 leaf to be controlled, especially if they're contact herbicides. So you can see here, this is the typical injury that you'd expect with this herbicide, but it's not going to kill these plants because they're too big. There's not enough product to get to every growing point on this weed, and they'll simply survive. So with contact herbicides, it's all about size. It's all about the plant that you're trying to target. It's all about coverage, getting that good coverage to get all product over the weed, and it's about good growing conditions, right? The more lush the environment is, the easier those plants are growing and taking up herbicide. So now we're going to compare two herbicides from a different family. We've looked at a lot of Group 2 herbicides. Now we're going to look at Group 4 or hormonal herbicides. And these herbicides, some of them act by only foliar uptake, and some have a mix of they can be taken up by the foliage of the plant. They also have they can be taken up by the roots and shoots of germinating seedlings, so they both have contact and residual control. Here we're going to compare two Group 4 herbicides with more or less contact control, very limited residual activity. And so again, looking at our white beans, if we come down here, you can see to the line, to my right, to your left, the white beans are much more affected with this herbicide. We see the twisting of the stems going down, the swelling of the shoots. More or less, this plant is kind of growing itself to death because these herbicides mimic a lot of growth hormone activity. And so here we have 2,4-diester applied post. Here on the left-hand side, we have MCPA ester applied post. And we do see the same types of injury. We see the aponesty or bending of the stems, the thickening of the stems, but you'd acknowledge, clear as day, one's a lot more affected than the other, and that just speaks to just the subtle differences in sensitivity. At the end of the day, both these are likely to die. Certainly these will die. You might have some survivors here, but the injury will be unacceptable. This does make sense because we know that 2,4-D is a little bit stronger on legumes. You know, we use it to control volunteer alfalfa, maybe some volunteer red clover, whereas MCPA, you know, not as good on alfalfa, can be used in certain provinces to control weeds in red clover at certain rates. So this is a nice example of same family of herbicides, but just a little bit more activity with one, in this case 2,4-D ester, versus this one here, MCP ester. Now, if we look at the white beans that were where both these products were applied prior to planting, we see almost no injury, one because of dry conditions, so let's get that out of the way, but also because there's very little residual activity in the soil with these two herbicides. So let's take a look there. So I do want to be careful. Neither one of these herbicides, 2,4-D ester or MCP ester, can be used prior to planting white beans, and clearly we know they really injure them when applied over white beans, but because it has very little to no residual activity, and especially this year when we've had no moisture to even move that herbicide with its limited residual activity into the soil, we see here pretty good crop safety with respect to white beans. And again, that's because these herbicides tend to have more kind of contact activity than residual activity on plant species. So we'll look at another two group 4 herbicides, but these ones have both contact and a little bit of residual control. But what's neat is we have some velvet leaf in here, and we can really kind of see the difference in terms of velvet leaf sensitivity to both of these herbicides. So if we go down here, I mean, a little bit larger velvet leaf than you'd want to see, but this is dicamba, the active ingredient in products like Ingenia or Extendamax, and we see that twisting of the velvet leaf plant. So, you know, this is about a week after application, so there's some optimism that these plants will die. If we contrast that to this group 4 herbicide over here, which is, the trade name is Lontrel, the active ingredient is clopyralid, you know, we're not seeing any activity really on these velvet leaf species, although quite a bit of activity on naturally the soybeans and the white beans. So there's an example of, you know, both from the same chemical family, one dicamba a little bit stronger on velvet leaf than clopyralid or Lontrel, which is not very strong on velvet leaf. So we'll finish off here with another contact herbicide. So this is a non-selective herbicide. Glufosinate is the active ingredient. The trade name is Liberty. Works extremely well in very hot conditions, but you know, as we notice here in not only the oats, but also the dry beans, you know, this herbicide kills what it hits or makes contact with, and if we don't get complete coverage, then we have things that don't die. So examples here, we have nice death, and either that came up after application or we just missed it for whatever reason, maybe a plug in the nozzle or something like that. In the oats we see here, this is most certainly up at the time of application, but we're just seeing an issue of coverage, right? We have good coverage here and we have plant death. We might not have as great coverage here. That could be a function of maybe taller plants, bushier plants, so density will have a factor. If we have a dense stand of vegetation, they're shading each other, not every droplet gets on the plant, it doesn't move within the plant. So some contact herbicides like 2,4-D and MCPA that we just looked at, when they make contact, get in the plant, they will move within the plant a bit. Not so much with Liberty, so you have to get tons of coverage to get good control, and if you don't, you have areas like this that most likely will survive. On a cereal crop, or any grass crop, how you try and see if it's going to survive is you kind of pull out the growing point, and if the growing point looks healthy, I give it a smell. If it smells like silage, I even sometimes give it a taste. This looks healthy, so this is going to live, right? So again, we need good coverage to cover that plant to get it to die. Same with the dry beans. And then if we look at Liberty when it's applied prior to crop emergence, it has no residual activity. It has no effect on any of the crops. So from that perspective, there's lots of flexibility to plant things after Liberty. It's just that if you're trying to kill things, you need good coverage. And so that's why a lot of the work done in the province shows that kind of midday applications when it's super sunny, there's lots of heat, we have over 20 gallons per acre of water, we're not chinching out on rates. then we get the best control with these purely contact herbicides.
There you have it. I hope you've enjoyed episode 4 of Ontario Diagnostic Days. If you have any questions for presenters, we'd love to hear from you. You can put those questions directly in the comments section on our YouTube channel, or look for contact information at the end of the video. Look for us next on October 17th at 8 p.m. when Diagnostic Days will be featured on The Agronomists, our live and interactive agronomy program on Real Agriculture. Host Lindsay Smith will be joined by Diagnostic Days presenters who will share more agronomy insights and answer your questions. We will see you on October 17th.
Ontario Diagnostic Days 2022 on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, the University of Guelph Ridgetown Campus, Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, Grain Farmers of Ontario, Agris Co-op, BASF Canada, Bear and DeKalb, Corteva and Pioneer, Great Lakes Grain, Mazex, The Mosaic Company, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta.